Good morning, everybody. My name is Adam Blackwell. I'm the Vice President International at Development Services Group. And on behalf of the team here at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, better known as GTAC, I'll be moderating this session. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. The views expressed are those of the presenter. Sophia Moskalenko is going to speak to us on mindfulness-based intervention, MBI, for resilience building among vulnerable populations. She is a program management specialist at the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, Behavioral Insights Hub, and after receiving her PhD in social and clinical psychology from the University of Pennsylvania, she focused her research on radicalization, self-sacrifice, martyrdom, and disinformation. As a research fellow at START, Dr. Moskalenko has worked on projects commissioned by multiple departments in the US government. She serves as a consultant to the European Commission, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and Georgia State University's Cybersecurity Unit. Dr. Moskalenko is a certified mindfulness instructor and is a designer of the Mindfulness-based initiative for building resilience against radicalization. Dr. Moskalenko has co-authored several books, including award-winning Friction, How Conflict Radicalizes Them and Us, The Marvel of Martyrdom, The Power of Self-Sacrifice in the Selfish World, and Pastels and Pedophiles Inside the Mind of QAnon. She'll speak for roughly 20 minutes, and we'll then have 20 minutes for discussion. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom and place your questions as Dr. Moskalenko is speaking. Over to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Adam, for the introduction, and thank you so much for having me. I am very happy to share the results of the project that I carried out from beginning to end recently. I think it has a lot of promise, and I hope to spread the word about it. So I am going to share my slides, and there we are. So I'm going to talk about countering radicalization with evidence-based MBSR tools. And if you have heard my name before today, it's probably in connection with the research I did in the field of radicalization and terrorism. However, I have a few years ago transitioned from research to the practitioner side of things when I joined the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, where, among other things, I was looking at effectiveness of different CV/PV programs around the world. And what I found in looking at those was the same thing that also the literature that assesses their effectiveness finds, namely that a lot of them are kind of haphazard, meaning they're not guided by any kind of theory or existent empirical data in their efforts. It's just a lot of well-meaning people and governments willing to spend money to address the problem, but how to address it is often kind of beyond the scope. They often focus on ideology. This was also the case with a lot of programs, even in the United States after 9/11, because ideology dominated the discourse about terrorist threat. We now know typically it's not the cause, it's often the consequence. We also now know, after 20 years of using ideology as a kind of guiding principle in how to address terrorism, that it's very misleading, and that in addressing ideology, we often disenfranchise and demonize and create grievances among the population who share the ideology, but not the radical kind of intentions of people that we are concerned with. And also, a lot of these programs that are active now and have been active in the past, they tend to either not measure any impact at all. Over 90% of all programming, there was a study recently, don't measure impacts. And when they do, they often measure impacts of things that are not relevant to radicalization or any kind of metric that they should be interested in. Or they may have zero effects on those metrics, and sometimes they may have net negative effects. So overall, there's a lot of work being done. It's not clear how well informed this work is in research on radicalization. There's a huge gap between research and practice in our field. And so stepping into this gap, I was trying to kind of bridge it. And as a clinical psychologist, as well as social, and as a practitioner of mindfulness and a certified teacher of mindfulness, I thought that there was probably a lot of good that I can bring into PVE, CVE practice if I bring the tools of mindfulness into it. So I'm going to tell you first about mindfulness and the practice of mindfulness, what it is. And second, I'm going to tell you about the reasons I thought it might be useful for CVE, PVE. So what is mindfulness, or MBSR? MBSR stands for Mindfulness-based Stress Reduction. It's a very highly regimented and scripted program that was developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is actually a microbiologist of all things. But because he was a microbiologist, maybe he was really interested in rigorous testing of this program. The program consists of these 6 elements. They include instruction on the physiology of stress, and the rest of these elements are very interactive. So the first element is kind of instructive, and then it's very interactive. Mindful movement, which can be Tai Chi or Qigong or yoga, some form of guided meditation, and there are several that typically are introduced in the course of MBSR. An emphasis and practice on connecting the mind and the body. Breathing practices, there are several different ones, and again, emphasis on moment-to-moment awareness. So a typical MBSR program goes on for 9 weeks, during which participants meet in a group once a week for about 3 hours, and then there is, at the end of the program, a full day session. They get homework assignments to practice things that they learned. And like I said, it's very highly scripted, so there's not much room for improvisation for people who teach it. And because of that, we can be quite confident in research that traces impacts of this program. And this research has been abundant. We now have tens of thousands of peer-reviewed articles that demonstrate effects on the brain of mindfulness practice. There are randomized controlled clinical trials that compare the effects of MBSR to traditional psychotherapy, as well as pharmacological treatments for almost every kind of psychological disorder: depression, anxiety, bipolar, substance abuse, stress-related physiological issues, such as autoimmune diseases, including asthma, diabetes, psoriasis, and so on. And they find that MBSR is as effective as, or sometimes more effective than, these traditional medical interventions. And finally, now, because MBSR has been around for decades, we have meta-analyses that look across a large number of these studies and demonstrate that this effect is consistent and quite sizable. So we can be confident in the effectiveness of MBSR. Now, why would MBSR be of any relevance to radicalization or de-radicalization or building resiliency to radicalization? One reason is that although, in the past, after 9/11, we had really good studies that showed that mental health is unrelated to radicalization, and that a typical terrorist was actually less likely to suffer from any kind of mental ailment than a random person picked off the street. But this began to change in the last couple of decades, and now across different ideological domains, right-wing, jihadi, identitarian groups like incels or QAnon, we see that the prevalence of mental health issues in people who hold these radical views is magnitudes greater than it is in a comparable population of their peers. And so one reason is that probably mental health is now playing some role in radicalization, and as a result, it can possibly be helpful to mitigate its role. And the second reason is that we have now a number of really good empirical studies that used well-tested elements of MBSR in laboratory settings and also in naturalistic settings, and demonstrated that teaching people these even single elements of mindfulness, as opposed to the whole 9-week program, has beneficial effects to reducing factors that we know are relevant to radicalization, namely MBSR training has positive effects on reducing anger. It actually is helpful in reducing violent recidivism among people who have previously offended and are, in prison. It has positive effects on reducing cognitive distortions that lead to political polarization. So when you misperceive the other group as being hostile to you or as being unjust to you, training people in mindfulness reduces those distortions. Mindfulness training also reduces prejudice. It reduces aggression in response to provocation. It reduces perceptions of the world as being dangerous and a hyperreactivity to any kind of perceived violation. And it reduces affective polarization. So altogether, it seemed to me like there is a good reason to at least try to introduce mindfulness training to CV/PVE community. And as a result, I have designed a workbook to train trainers who deal with vulnerable populations who are at high risk of being radicalized because maybe they've been exposed to a radical population, maybe they have previously been a part of a radical population, or maybe their past history and their background make them kind of a high target for being approached by radical groups. So this training manual is designed to be used in conjunction with actual training. So it's not enough to just read the book. You have to kind of experience it while training. And because I come from research, I think it's really important to have assessment. So the manual also includes instruments for measuring changes in all the different criteria that I just mentioned in the slide before, as well as recommendations for how to use it, the trainers who train in it, how to implement it then with the population that they're tasked to work with, and how to do follow-up assessments immediately as well as sometime later to measure durability of change. The manual that I created is very different from a traditional MBSR training because I was very sensitive to the limitations on people who work in the PVE/CVE field as far as their availability for time and training. So, most of the time they don't have the ability to go into a 9-week program and engage in, a lot of follow-up and so on. It has to be kind of a limited scope of time. And also because, these people are not going to be certified mindfulness trainers, they will not have gone through the 40-week of training that I had gone through. I have pruned all the more kind of nuanced and experiential things from the manual and left just those elements of MBSR that are really highly scripted, where people can almost read from the workbook, hopefully not, but if they needed to, they could, leaving very little room for practitioner error. I also only left modules that are easily translatable across cultural contexts and can be scaled up or down depending on the needs of the population, the age of the population. So if you're dealing with, teenagers, it's probably different than if you're dealing with mature adults. And there's some practices that are harder for teenagers, but are easier for adults. So the manual allows for flexibility for trainers when dealing with the populations that they're charged with. And also, this training is designed to be delivered through a variety of different modalities. So in person, of course, is ideal, but again, the limitations on these people, and also sometimes the limitations are placed on me by governments who are sponsoring the program. And I can't actually go to the camp where these people are housed, and I can't therefore have live trainings with trainers who live and work in the camps. So for that reason, it is designed to be delivered also virtually. And like I said, it includes measures that could be used for pre and post and longitudinal measures to assess change. So the first pilot I delivered of this program was for IOM, the International Organization of Migration, which is part of the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism. And specifically, this IOM chapter is based in Qatar, and they are working with a population of Afghani evacuees in a camp in Doha called CAS. So these people obviously are quite traumatized. They, at the very minimum, they have lost their entire lives, their homeland, their families, their work, everything. And very often these people have very little certainty about what's going to happen to them and when. Some of them are stuck in the camp, which is designed to be, weeks long duration. Some of them are there for months. And all of that together adds up to them becoming sometimes, angry and belligerent, and sometimes there were incidents of self-harm and harm to others. So it's a concern, and UN Office of Counterterrorism felt that there was a need for something like that, and so I was invited to deliver this training. These are the modules that the workbook combines, and I was able to deliver all of them, including the educational module, the breathing techniques, body scan meditation, which is one form of guided meditation, befriending meditation, a different kind of meditation, mindful eating practice, mindful yoga, and I was able to gather some evaluation data as a result. This is just an example of what an educational module looks like. I explain how the nervous system functions normally and how it functions under stress, and what kinds of biological switches exist that trigger the prolonged stress response, and how mindfulness training will teach people to flip these switches back. Basically, it's a hack for, very simply, this one nerve that you see on the diagram, and we can hack it through breathing techniques and through movement techniques and so on. And in doing so, to allow the body to exit this fight or flight response that very often leads to behaviors and choices that are very harmful to the individual as well as people around them. So that's one module. These are actually the trainers that I worked with, some of them from the Afghani evacuees camp. The rest of the training was delivered like this, with us kind of in a circle and moving and breathing and meditating to facing each other. This is part of some of the yoga practices that I taught this group, more on the nuances of teaching mindful movement a little later, but basically these are very, very simple poses that even people with some physical limitations are able to do. And the point is not really to do an exercise as much as it is to continue practicing moment-to-moment awareness while moving the body, and to practice feeling the connection between the mind and the body, which is kind of part and parcel of mindfulness practice. So again, the emphasis is not on the exercise of yoga, it is on the mindfulness of moving. And this is just part of some of the assessment tools that I used for this group. Some of these are very well-validated measures of exposure to trauma and radicalization, and some of them are questions that I designed to assess responses to this particular training and kind of a perception of mindfulness by these people who are dealing with very specific populations for which no measurement tool has yet been developed. And so that was one program that I delivered for IOM Qatar. Participants were 20 members of the staff from CAS. The total population of people in their care is over 300, and these include men, women, and children. So some of the trainers I worked with work just with children. They're kind of an educational group. Some work with families, some work with women. It's a very mixed group. The training took place over 3 consecutive days. I had half a day with these people, and afterwards they were kind of discharged, but with instructions to practice some of the things they learned as homework. Since then, I have delivered a different pilot project, this time via Zoom. And this was a Department of State grant that I'm part of that caters to families of foreign terrorist fighters that were returned from ISIS-held territories to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And the number of people, ultimate beneficiaries, these families of foreign terrorist fighters, is much smaller. It's about 45 people. One could argue that they are a higher risk group, and some of them have experienced horrendous trauma. Probably, you know, well, I mean, I'm not gonna go into that. But the duration was 4 sessions, 2 hours each, and it was done over Zoom. And I delivered the same scope of training, so the entirety of the workbook, and then the practitioners got the workbook itself afterwards, so they could use it when delivering the training. I also made myself available for any follow-up questions or issues that might come up. So I'm in touch with these people by WhatsApp and email and so on. I already told you this. Okay, so these are some data that I collected when I asked people questions about how they feel about mindfulness training, having completed it. So these are trainers answering questions about the training that I delivered to them. And as you see, the vast majority, 92%, said that they intend to use it in their work. 83% felt that mindfulness training would benefit the people that they work with, so either Afghani evacuees or families of foreign terrorist fighters. 92% said that MBI training will be very helpful for their work. 92% said that they would definitely, and they emphasized it to me in person as well, they would recommend this training to their colleagues who haven't actually experienced it. 83% said that, sorry, 83% said that mindfulness training was extremely helpful to themselves. 83% said that they would continue practicing what they learned in the course of the training after it was over. So they would continue keeping up with all of these practices that they've learned. 92% said that because of the MBI training, they feel they're now much better at reacting to stress. And one thing that I learned in working with these groups of people is that their work is extremely stressful. I'll circle back to it at the end of my talk. 83% said that due to the training, because of the training, they're much better at calming down after upsetting experiences, including upsetting experiences at their work. More than half said that due to MBI training, they're now much better at dealing with difficult people, which of course is critical for them being able to carry out their duties. 67% said that due to MBI training, they're much better at avoiding or de-escalating conflicts. And again, this is very relevant to their work, of course. And so overall, the report, these anonymous questionnaires that I collected from people, they say that majority found MBI training very helpful for managing their own stress, for de-escalating conflicts, for dealing with difficult situations and people, and most important, for applying it to their work. And vast majority planned on doing just that after the training was over, as well as they would really recommend it to their colleagues. Now, again, as a researcher, I would have wanted to collect questionnaires, not just from trainers, but from people they deliver training to. But because of limitations placed on me by actual organizations in charge of these people, that was not possible at all. I couldn't do it. I was able to communicate via WhatsApp with people that I trained, and I received very favorable feedback with some caveats. So I'm going to talk about those a little bit. As you might imagine, these two populations are staunchly Muslim populations. So, there's some culture of honor and hypermasculinity, which prevents people from, showing any kind of weakness. And sometimes, when you go through mindfulness training, connecting with your emotions can feel like weakness, even if you don't share any of it, even if you don't have to talk about it, and you don't have to talk about it, it can still feel like weakness. So where there was any kind of, not negative feedback, but kind of tentative feedback, it was with dealing with kind of middle-aged men, particularly among Afghani evacuees. There were no men in the foreign terrorist fighter families population in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. That is not to say that they necessarily, expressed anything negative. It's just that maybe they were not eager to sign up or to express any kind of positive feedback. Where there was positive, overwhelmingly positive feedback was where it came to delivering this training to teenagers of all genders, women and children, and sometimes more elderly population. There, the feedback I get from trainers is that it's very, very welcome, and they can see, they say, positive changes in people's demeanor, in how they react to others around them, to their family members, even to the trainers. So I would say that on average, without a doubt, it was a success. Now, there are several things that came up that I hadn't planned on. Some of these may be fruitful directions. Some of these are challenges. One thing that I hadn't actually planned on was just how overwhelmed these trainers are in their work. They often spend more than 10 hours a day in the midst of this population of very high need, who are the population themselves. These people, are themselves very stressed, and they lash out, or they, even some of the stories they share with trainers can produce very high level vicarious trauma. So the trainers themselves are kind of traumatized. They're often overworked. They feel like they're not helpful. They feel kind of helpless. What can they do when the person is sitting at a camp for 6-8 months, when the camp is designed to be, their stay for a few weeks, and the person is unable to get any kind of clarity on when they're going to get out of it? And the trainers are the face of the camp for the person. And so all of that frustration, all of that anxiety is then for them to deal with, and they can't give any answers, right? So one thing I realized was that these trainers themselves are a high need population. And I think the sooner we as a field realize that this is a high need population and start delivering resources to them to deal with their trauma and their stress, the more good we can possibly hope for. If a person is stressed out and is struggling with PTSD, they cannot help others. It's, like on the plane, if you need to put an oxygen mask on yourself before you can help anybody else. And these people, in my experience, often cannot help anybody else because they don't have oxygen themselves. So that's one thing I realized. Another thing I realized is that initially I planned this practice as something that ideally would be delivered directly to the population of beneficiaries. But having conversed with the trainers and asked them questions and heard their feedback, I think it's actually a lot more effective as a train-the-trainer program, because every population comes with a kind of subculture. Even on the grounds of the camps themselves, there are subtle, cultural nuances to different populations. And coming from outside and sharing very little in terms of culture with these people, even though I am very well versed in mindfulness training, I'm not probably the best person to help people in the camp. The trainers are better positioned in terms of which module they can use with whom. Is this a population who's going to be really resistant to deeper meditation practices because it would mean that they would have to deal with emotions and they're not ready to do it? And then maybe we don't touch those, at least yet. Is this a population who is not very verbal, even in their native language, and then maybe, we do things that are very movement oriented, but not very cognitive and not very conversation heavy. So things like that are critically important for rapport and for the potential positive effects of the training. Another important thing is this difference between genders and ages that came up with these particular groups. That's not to say that it's going to come up every single time, but I do suspect that, this masculine culture will be the same whether it's a population of, Muslims, or it's a population of right-wing, people. There's probably going to be the same kind of resistance among men, specifically of middle age, and resistance doesn't mean that they refuse. It just means that we have to work a little harder and be a little more creative in how to help these people better. So this is the state of the art. I will be very happy to get your feedback, questions, insight, because this is still a work in progress, and I hope that it will become better, and maybe you can help as well. Thank you.
Sophia, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Very, very useful. I have two quick questions for you. One is somebody is asking, will the slides be available to distribute to those who want them, or can we put them on our website?
I'm happy to share my slides. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, we could have used this a few years ago when we were doing youth violence prevention work with violence interrupters here in the United States. And without doubt, the most popular course was trauma-informed care. So I think you have hit on something very, very important here. So the first question is, how would you be able to implement a program like this in a high incident conflict country like or such as Syria, with many of the challenges that you just mentioned?
So I would have to know a little more about whom we're trying to benefit in Syria. Syria is a big country. There are different regions and different state of warfare. And, if we're delivering this to trainers on the ground in Syria, then I would want to know who these trainers are working with. And, I see no reason why it would be any different delivering virtual trainings to people in Syria than it is delivering them to people who are in Kyrgyzstan. The only thing is that the trainers need to speak English, or if they don't speak English, then there has to be some preliminary work done with translators who will, prior to being live with me and the trainers, would have access to the workbook, have time to speak with me about particular terms, because it's actually really important how the language is used. And then it can be done via translators. But I don't see a particular, barrier to delivering it in Syria as opposed to any other place in the world.
Okay. The next question is, with recent headlines about the neo-Nazis rejecting their beliefs after taking MDMA, how much is any psychological or cognitive shift effective at dislodging radical and hateful beliefs?
So I am on record for, because I've done a lot of research in radicalization, saying that ideology is not a factor that we should be fighting against, because it's not a factor that brings people to radicalization. That being said, ideology is not psychology. Psychology is much, much more than that. And in terms of radicalization, things that do bring people to it are grievances and trauma and connections with people who are radical. And all those things are based in psychology. And all those things have an element of choice. And what mindfulness training does is it allows a person to separate the space between stimulus and response and inject an element of choice into it. So when somebody acts toward you in a way that you perceive as insulting, or humiliating or aggressive. With mindfulness training, instead of reacting right away as you would coming out of your past and your trauma and your beliefs, you have space, you have mental space to breathe and to even ask yourself, is this exactly how I see it? Or maybe not. And to choose to act out with the consequences that you can appraise to some degree or not. And just that alone, statistically speaking, should reduce the likelihood of people, acting on impulses and following others for, whatever reason into radical action, and lashing out because of their own past trauma and their history and pressure from their group and whatever.
Here's a bit of a segue from that previous question. You have mentioned the mental health issues of jihad and far-right extremists. However, it is known that terrorists are really random and senseless in their activities because they are smart and skillful individuals. How do you define mental issues in the context of terrorism?
So as I started, by saying, as I started this presentation, we used to know this about terrorists, that they're very smart and skillful, and that's how they're able to plan attacks like 9/11, like 7/7 bombing. But because of 20 years of radicalization research and investment in security and policing, we have created a bottleneck for this kind of terrorism. There is no new Al-Qaeda on the horizon. These small face-to-face secretive groups, if they operate, they're rather quickly found out and dismantled before they're able to really strike. And what came out of that instead, what rose to the top when we were able to press down on this kind of group is a kind of grassroots movement that attracts anybody around the world through the internet and social media to join, like travel to Syria and join ISIS, or to, join a right-wing militia group. And that new age kind of radical, not necessarily terrorist, but that new age radical is very different in psychological makeup. That's why we're now seeing the change in mental health prevalence, is because these small face-to-face groups used to weed out problematic people, because they would break secrecy, they were liability. But if you are somebody who can build a fertilizer bomb or like a pressure cooker bomb in your kitchen using blueprints that you find online, there's nobody to care about your mental health status. So objectively speaking, we now have data from these different kinds of ideological domains that show that there is a much higher prevalence of people with previously diagnosed mental health issues, let alone undiagnosed mental health issues, which means that, people who in the former years would have just, ruminated in whatever thoughts they had and probably have done nothing, are now able to get social support online from people who share their radical beliefs and know-how for how to carry out these beliefs all the way to attacks. And that's the kind of radicalization we have to worry about today, more than the small, secretive, planful, very high level kind of strategic terrorist group. So we're not going to get everybody with one PV-CV program. The hope is that we're going to reduce the risk of radicalization among those people who come to radicalization, for reasons like past trauma, which is very often actually, even among people who are planful and smart, they very often come from a place of severe past trauma. People who are feeling disconnected and lost and alone, and they join a radical group for that reason. People who have been kind of exposed to a radical ideology because they, especially these foreign terrorist fighter families, like they're kids who grew up within ISIS-held territories. To them, it's normal. Torture is normal, beheadings are normal, and their psyche is not well. And so hopefully, for those people at least, exposure to mindfulness tools and training with them and practice with them will reduce the chance that they will proceed to radical action.
Thank you, Sophia. Another question here is, can you talk about the challenges of bringing a program like this to scale? Is this a program that should be considered to be administered universally rather than targeted to at-risk populations? And I guess I would add my own little grain here. What about, domestic violence interrupters or people dealing with cartels and gangs?
I will probably sound very biased here, but if I had a magic wand, I would bring mindfulness training to anybody and everybody who would take it. I think we're living in a very stressful time of rapid change and a lot of uncertainty, a lot of social changes and cultural changes and climate changes, and our psyches are not quite as well equipped to deal with it, as they are with more traditional challenges. So I would be ecstatic to make this training available to people, who live in cartel-held territories and stuff. In fact, mindfulness training is now being very successfully used. There are empirical studies in like American military populations who are like high risk, like special forces units, among policemen and first responders, because of how demanding their jobs are and how necessarily stressful they are and how much trauma these people encounter, in order to make them better able to deal with the challenges of their job, but also actually also to just, make their quality of life better. So that's a very general question. In terms of scaling, so in a way, this program is designed to be scaled. So when I deliver training to 20 trainers, the idea is that they will then carry it forward to over 300 beneficiaries. And eventually, like, I am available to them while they're doing it, but eventually they're going to be adept enough with delivering this training that they're not going to need my help and can just keep doing it. Also, one thing that IOM proposed, and I highly supported, was to have some of these trainers, the ones who would volunteer, trained as trainers of trainers. So they would do what I did for them, for other trainers in the camp. And part of the reason is there's a serious turnout issue for these trainers. They burn out and they don't stay for 5 years. They're there for a year and then maybe they leave and the training leaves with them. But if this idea was put into practice, then there could be some continuance, and people could be constantly trained in this. And ideally, every trainer in the camp would be able to deliver training to other people. Not to mention, I think it would just do wonders for them, as a population, and maybe reduce the burnout and maybe reduce the rate of turnout for them. So that's my answer to the scalability question.
There's a couple of questions here before we wrap up, and I think it's fair to say that the one here is, has there been criticism of the program as placating legitimate human responses to actual injustices and possibly forcing oppressed people to accept a status quo?
Why would that be placating anything? I mean, teaching people to recognize their body's stressful responses and to meet themselves physically, emotionally, and mentally exactly where they are, as opposed to spiraling out of control with ruminative thoughts or obsessive thoughts, or with physiological reactions of, hyperventilation and, just constant stress that causes them lack of sleep, which itself, is a cascade of mental health issues and so on. How is that placating anything? I'm not in any way suggesting, and the training never suggests, any kind of consideration for ideology. There's no need for self-disclosure at all. We're not talking about where these people came from unless they spontaneously want to share. We never ask. we feel that there is a common humanity that transcends, places and past and future, that we're all, human in some profound and fundamental ways. And there's a way to be, ourselves in the present moment with awareness and with kindness. So if it's placating anything, it's placating, the person's own kind of self-pressure and patterns of reactions that can be maladaptive for themselves, but for others too. Somebody who is in a constant state of stress, this fight or flight response, is not going to adequately respond to even a completely benign situation. That's just a fact of life. And enabling people to respond normatively to benign situation is absolutely going to make them better able to function day to day. And that's just going to be, I don't see the downside to that.
I agree. Good. And I think that was a good answer. The last question here is one we struggle with in the work for the State Department is, probably 90% of the terrorism incidents take place predominantly in countries where there's political and economic instability and inequity. Often where governments are barely able to meet the basic needs of people. How do you think that this model could be applied in those kinds of environments?
Maybe like I am a little bit still defensive because of the last question. It could be interpreted that this question is like, are we trying to solve a small problem when there is a bigger problem? And I totally relate. I'm Ukrainian, and I've been there for the 2014 revolution, and I feel like it was absolutely the right thing to do. And I'm very much supportive of what Ukrainians are doing now. So when there is injustice, I will not say that we should just breathe deeply through it. That's not what this is at all. Injustice, is injustice. And that's separate from how we are as individuals. So, I've seen people in Ukraine burn out completely. My very good friends, from childhood, diminished as a functioning person because they just can't deal with the magnitude of the disaster that they are living through. And other people are more resilient. Yes, the disaster is all around them. Their loved ones who are dead and their loved ones who are crippled and their lives that are lost forever and on and on. But you can live through a disaster and come out of it whole, or the disaster can destroy you. And I think the aim of this program is to give people a little more resilience to things that are beyond their control. So I, as a trainer, and I don't think anybody else, can't do much to change the situations of systemic injustice and horrific suffering. And maybe, while we're on this earth, it's not going to ever be resolved. We only have this much control, and this program, I firmly believe, gives people a little more control over this much in their life, which could be just enough to allow them to live through a disaster and come out of it in one piece, and also not make the disaster bigger for other people around them.
Sophia, excellent responses and excellent presentation, and you definitely don't need to feel defensive. I think all of us who've worked in very stressful, difficult situations, whether they be in the United States or in my case, in countries in conflict, recognize that the work that you do and the whole idea of trying to help people who are, violence interrupters, people who are trying to deal in these incredibly stressful situations, survive actually, is incredibly important. So I would really like to thank you for bringing this to us. And again, if you don't mind sharing the slides, I've had a number of requests asking to see them. Again, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for listening in, and wish you continued success, Sophia. And I hope that things start to improve in the Ukraine very soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.